University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
Welcome to the Walk-Ons. I'm Josh.
I'm Sawyer.
And I'm John. We're not your average sports fans.
We scream at our TVs, skip work for March Madness, and hate the Patriots. Besides Sawyer.
Guilty.
But what we're more interested in is what happens outside the stadium.
Should taxpayers fund sports arenas?
The grocery store isn't asking for big subsidies from government. We're taking from people we patronize every day and asking them to pay more to subsidize an already wealthy baseball team owner or football team owner.
Doesn't make sense to pay college athletes.
So many people in America see college sports as a very nostalgic extension of high school sports. It's not that. It's a $6 billion a year industry, and the people who are creating this wealth do not get to participate.
Because they want to make money off of those brackets. Everybody gets a chance to eat except the players.
What is this going to look like? Pay men, but not pay women? In reality, that is what this conversation has been.
Basic common fairness.
Have sports become too politicized?
Must they run their mouths like that? LeBron and Kevin, you're great players, but no one voted for you. Millions elected Trump to be their coach.
The statement that the White House put out essentially disinvites the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles from the White House.
What does it mean to be more than an athlete?
We stand here tonight accepting our role in uniting communities to be the change we need to see.
One of Harvey's greatest is J.J. Watt.
Because you feel helpless seeing water rush down streets that I drive down every day. I said, how can I help? Let's see if I can raise a little bit of money to help these people out.
This podcast is about looking at the world through the lens of sports.
Each episode, we'll sit down with someone and dive into a topic at the intersection of policy, society, and the games we all love.
Must they run their mouths like that?
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Walk-Ons. For our inaugural episode, we decided to stay close to home. Today, our guest is Misho Ceko, Chief Operating Officer of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and owner of Chicago Mixed Martial Arts. We sit down with him to discuss the world of MMA, its rise in popularity, the gender dynamics, and some of the growing health concerns. Enjoy. Misho, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you fill us in on your background a little bit? You exist in these seemingly two different worlds.
So, I have professionally, I work for the University of Chicago, the Harris School of Public Policy. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer there and for the most part handle operations for the school. In the evenings, I also, which is probably more interesting for some folks, is that I do martial arts. And so I've had a mixed martial arts school for about the last 10 years. And so during the day, I wear my suit, and in the evenings, I wear my spats.
Mm-hmm. You're like Batman.
Maybe.
So how did you get into MMA?
So I've always been passionate about martial arts. So even as a kid, watching, I grew up in the 80s. So that was a decade of the Karate Kid and the Jean-Claude Van Damme movies. And you guys might be too young to remember Kickboxer and Tung Po. In 1993, the first UFC happened, right? So this is in November 1993, and I think I was a freshman in college. And a bunch of my friends and I would pull together all our money, and I bought this pay-per-view. And the marketing for the show was like ridiculous. It was like, all right, 2 men enter, 1 man leave. The bloodiest fight you'll ever see, and everyone's just like, oh, you're just transfixed. You're like, what is this going to be about? It's $60. Okay, everyone has $10. Let's put our money together. Let's see what happens. And so I actually remember watching the first UFC, so maybe 25 years ago. And I remember the first match. You'll never forget it. So they had this Dutch kickboxer. His name was Gerard Gordeau, 6'5", 220. He's just a big dude. And he was fighting a Samoan sumo wrestler, and his name was like Tui. And, this fight started. And there's a lot of energy because no one knew what to expect. Like, was this going to be WWF or WWE, and were they just wrestling, or it's choreographed, or was it real? And the fight lasted 25, 26 seconds. It was fast. It was over like as soon as it started. And you're left with this image of this Dutch kickboxer kicking the guy in the mouth. They didn't wear mouthpieces at that point. It was too early. Nobody knew what to do. And you see his teeth flying across the ring. And so not only did the guy's teeth fly across the ring, some of his other teeth were left embedded in the Dutch kickboxer's foot after they kick. And at that point, everyone's like, yeah, this is different than WWE. And that was kind of the start of it for me, at least.
So you go to school, you worked in Mozambique, and then you land back in Chicago. How and why open up your own gym?
So yeah, so when I started training officially in 1998, so just over 20 years ago, when I walked into my first Gracie Jiu-Jitsu gym, and I fell for it immediately. It's something you either love or you hate, and once you love it, it's something that becomes part of you forever. And so I was always doing it. I went back to graduate school. I think it was in 2004. And I was in the middle of a career change, thinking about what I want to do with the rest of my life. And after grad school, I started doing some consulting, but I was always training on the side. I always kept up that part. In 2009, I got a job in Mozambique with the United Nations. And so I moved there with my wife at that point. And, the job would be great, but I was like, what am I going to do in Mozambique for a year? And I have to figure out, where am I going to train? You need to work out. And
yeah, do they do MMA there?
So I was like, there's the chances of finding a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school in Mozambique. I was like, yeah, it's slim or none, right? And so I did some research, and I found a judo school. I was like, oh, judo and jiu-jitsu is very similar. I'm going to go check it out. I emailed the instructor. I didn't speak Portuguese, and so he spoke a little English. He's like, yeah, just swing by. No problem. So I come by. This is the first day there in the country. And I introduced myself, and it's me and a bunch of Mozambicans, and he's like, okay, yeah, come and work out with us, no problem. They start class with sparring. I was like, okay, usually you warm up, and this is a little bit different. And so he's like, oh, you're gonna train with this guy. So we start sparring and immediately go for a takedown. And when I was taking the guy down, he put his arm on the mat, and his elbow broke. It flexed the wrong way. And I hear him just screaming. In the whole room, that just stops. And everyone's seeing me on top of this guy. They met me 60 seconds ago. I'm on top of this guy, and he's screaming in pain. I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna get killed here. And the teacher's like, oh, don't worry, accidents happen. He fell incorrectly. So we take him to the hospital, and we're sitting in the hospital room. I'm in the country for less than 24 hours. I'm in a Mozambican hospital. And the guy's he's like, don't worry, I felt bad about it. The kid's, he was probably 19 or 20, and his family's there. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll pay for it. Don't worry. And the teacher's like, forget it, this happens. But why don't you go train at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school down the street?
So there was one there the whole time.
And so he literally drove me to the Jiu-Jitsu school. And we pull up to this old building, and we walk out, and he calls the instructor out, who was a Brazilian guy. And he said, oh, this guy, they're speaking Portuguese. And he's like, this guy wants to train with you. And the other guy, the Brazilian guy, didn't speak any English. And he's asking him questions to translate. He's like, oh, ask him how long he's been training. And at that point, I was 14 or 15 years. And the guy's 4 or 5 years. I said, no, I understood what he said. I said, no, 14, 15. He's like, what belt are you? I was like, oh, I'm a black belt. He's like, okay, you're the teacher, and we're going to be the students. Because he was a blue belt at that time.
So technically, that was the first gym you ran.
Yeah. And so we took his gym and we kind of evolved it into a much bigger jiu-jitsu gym, and I actually turned it into a mixed martial arts gym. A lot of African countries, boxing and martial arts as a tradition that dates back to Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee, and they really love martial arts.
So it seems like MMA has been increasing in popularity for the last 10, 15 years. Seems like there's an interesting, historians will make note that there was this huge increase in us wanting to watch people, beat the living hell out of each other. And I mean, you've been in this world for a while. So what do you think's kind of behind this surge in popularity in MMA?
So I think the interest in combat has always been around, right?
Mm-hmm.
The martial arts isn't new, and it doesn't start at the UFC.
Mm-hmm.
And it dates back decades and longer than that, right? What I think the UFC did that was it invented a new sport, right? When it first came out, people didn't understand what martial arts was, right? You saw taekwondo, you saw karate, you saw, wrestling wasn't considered a martial art. And the first few UFCs, they identified what worked and what didn't work, right? It was almost like a lab. And they saw wow, grappling really works, and having flashing kicks against someone who's going to take you down is worthless. So if you watch the UFCs, the first 3 or 4, Weis Gracie won, right? He won 1, 2, and then 4. I think he got hurt in 3. And he was just a skinny 170-pound guy, and he didn't have muscles, but he was just very technical, and he grabbed you, he took you down, he submitted you. It was very simple. And he knew exactly what he was going to do, and he did it. And then as the sport evolved, you saw people are like, okay, if I stay on my feet, I'm not going to get submitted, I'm not going to lose. And then you saw an evolution where kickboxers who could learn some takedown defense. They started winning because then I can punch and I'm not going to go in the mat. And eventually it evolved where wrestlers learned some kickboxing, but they could dictate where a fight goes because they can take you down to the mat, or they can keep the fight standing if they're better on their hands. And so over time, now it's actually really evolved into a true mixed martial art. You don't see styles where it's like, oh, I'm a taekwondo or I'm a karate person or I'm a jiu-jitsu guy. They're really mixed martial artists, right? Mm-hmm. And their styles have evolved from 25. If you watch a fight 25 years ago, it would be unrecognizable compared to a fight today. And, the sport has grown because there is, it's like any major sport where there's a lot of marketing dollar behind it and they start telling stories. The highest grossing fights in boxing or in mixed martial arts aren't necessarily the best two guys fighting each other, right? It's the best storyline, right? And so I think boxing still does a great job of creating storylines. And MMA is getting better at it. I think the biggest pay-per-view event in the last probably 4 or 5 years was McGregor and Mayweather, right? Mm-hmm. And that should not have been a big draw. Mayweather had, he was 49 or 50-0, and McGregor had 0 boxing matches, and it turned into a very interesting fight. And it was like, I think it was the second largest pay-per-view ever behind Pacquiao and Mayweather.
Right. So the draw is more maybe just the competition rather than the blood sport.
Yeah, I think it's the storyline. Like people like to see the underdog. They'd like to see the hero and the villain. Like there has to be a catch to it. And it's like any story, right? There's an arc to the storyline, right? What's the narrative behind it, and how do you tell it?
So what is the makeup of your gym? Is it folks from all walks of life, or are they there mainly for self-defense, or is it to train to compete?
Yeah. So so when I moved back to Chicago in, I think, 2010, I was looking for a place not only to train, but something that was a little bit different than what existed out there. And so, for me, a gym was more than a place to work out. It's a community, right? And so training jiu-jitsu for the last 20 years, no matter where I went in the world, I found a bond instantly with people I've trained. So like I've trained in, Japan and the Balkans and Africa and Latin America and Brazil. And you have an instant community regardless of where you go. And I kind of wanted to build that type of community in Chicago for myself and some of my friends that also trained. And so when we created a place, it wasn't a business venture, it was more of a social venture, right? It's a place that we can train that's affordable and accessible to everybody. And I would never turn away someone who couldn't afford to pay, right? And so you always have to contribute to the gym, but you will train there if it's the right place for you. Mm-hmm. And so I started the process, it was 10 years. 10 years ago, we opened up a rented space from a small Taekwondo school. And over the years, it's evolved. And then we got our own space about 6 years ago in Lincoln Park. And in terms of like the people that work out, it is people from all walks of life, right? It's men and women from, we have a kids program to have people in their 50s who train, right? And people who are brand new or people who have been doing martial arts for 30 years.
Right. And so that's interesting. Like it's such on the outset, it's such a hyper masculine sport, right? But you said you have a lot of women in there. What's kind of been the growth of MMA popularity amongst women as opposed to, as a whole? Is that a decent percentage of your gym? Or
I tell people you'll never know who's going to be good at martial arts when they walk in the door, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not about the muscle, it's about the things you can't see. It's the heart, right? It's not like you're just in there and you're hitting a bag, right? That's more of a workout. Right? Here you're actually competing, and you're competing daily. So as a beginner, you're getting thrown around and beat up for the first 6 to 12 months before you figure out what's going on. And it takes, mentally, that's very difficult, walking into a gym knowing that you're going to get smashed for the next 60 minutes and then go home, and you're actually going to feel good about yourself because you've progressed. And in terms of the makeup of the gym, it's probably more men than women, but I definitely see the popularity of the sport growing amongst women. And a couple things. In co-ed programs, I think it can be intimidating for men and women to walk into the gym. We recently launched a dedicated women's program, and then you just saw it blow up. It's women teaching women. And I think it makes the sport more accessible. And then once people get comfortable in the gym, they take classes in all the programs, right? And so it's getting that first step in the door has been a challenge for a lot of people. Even for me, like for the first 3 years, I was nervous walking into the gym because I knew I was going to get smashed.
Right. It definitely seems like an intimidating environment.
It's not fun, right? And so, but walking in that door and getting over that barrier, getting through that barrier,